Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to Wix Wiz. Today I will be giving an intro to HTTP functions in Wix. These allow you to expose your site's API and use it as a server, which is a key to allowing other apps to interact with your Wix website. So let's get started. So before we get down to the nitty-gritty of implementation, I just want to say two words about what HTTP is and try and give an overview of what we're about to do. So essentially, HTTP is a protocol for how servers interact over the web. And essentially, that is how information is structured and passed over the internet. And to give a very, very simple example, so every time you put a URL in your browser and you navigate to a page, essentially what you're doing is you're sending a specific address to a server and saying, okay, give me whatever information is at that address, whatever files, whatever functions are at that address. For a regular web page, essentially what you're getting back to your browser is HTML files, CSS files, JavaScript files, and that's what's used to construct the web page on your browser. You can also send instructions to receive other sorts of information to the server. And it could be that the server will do some computations on that end and send you back some kind of raw data, such as JSON format data. And that's more what we're going to be focusing on today. But the general concept of what HTTP is and how the internet works is pretty much the same for if you're navigating to a regular web page or if you're using these HTTP functions. And what these HTTP functions let you do on your Wix website is essentially expose the backend of your Wix website and use it as a server. So that means people can send requests to your server and get back information that's not only in the form of a web page. And here we have in front of us the documentation for the HTTP functions in Wix. And you can see here on the side that we have several methods here. And in general, all these methods are split up into two. So there is the request and the response. And there are the request methods and the response methods. And the request is essentially what the user who is seeking the information is sending to the server. And the response is what the server sends back. So in a regular situation, the request will be for whatever HTML file is at that end, and the response will be that HTML file. But in this case, it could be that the request will be for a certain piece of information that is stored in a database, and the response will be that information. When it comes to HTTP functions and sending data requests, there are different formats that are acceptable. And we are going to be styling our APIs and our webhooks all based on REST API, which is the more prevalent method today. There are other approaches to dealing with APIs, but I think that giving you the information about REST APIs will be the most relevant. And essentially, REST APIs, again, I'm simplifying a lot of things here just to make it come across quickly. But in terms of REST APIs, there are essentially four actions that can be done on the side of the API. And that is what you see here in terms of the request. So if we go over here, you'll see here get, post, put, delete. Okay, so those are essentially the four actions that can be done on the server side, and we're going to be explaining more about this in a moment. There, you might also hear about something called patch, which is another fifth thing that can be done, but we're not going to be dealing with it here. And in terms of responses, there are many different responses that can be given back to the user from the server. And what Wix has done is they've simplified some of these responses and given them individual methods which handle these responses. On a regular server or other ways of building a server, There might not be pre-made responses like this, but essentially what you'd send back is an HTTP response code, and different responses have different implications. So if the response code is in the 200s, that means it's a successful operation. If it's in the 300s, that would be redirection. If it's in the 400s, that means something went wrong because of something that the client did. And if it's in the 500s, then that means something went wrong in terms of the server. And you can choose from these different codes depending on what you want, the information that you want to convey to the person who is accessing the API or the HTTP function. And Wix has gone ahead and kind of simplified that a bit. And they've taken some of the more popular status codes and they've turned them into their own methods. So for example, forbidden, which would be 403, that means somebody is trying to access information that they shouldn't have access to. Or not found means they're trying to access information that doesn't exist, etc. And we're going to talk more about each of these individual things. So let's get down to how we actually use these HTTP functions in Wix practically. So over here, I have a Wix site, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on dev mode. And once I've turned dev mode on, let me just zoom in a little bit. So here on the side, we have our public and backend, and we're going to be adding a special backend file that is especially for these HTTP functions. So if you go ahead and you click this plus sign over here, you'll see all the way down here, you'll see expose site API. And when you click on that, it'll create a JavaScript file called http functions.js. And this is where we are supposed to write our HTTP functions. And here we just have some of the documentation, and we have some example functions over here. And you can see that these functions are built in a certain way. So we have get, okay, which is our request method, and we have the name of the endpoint. Here we run some kind of logic, some kind of function, and we try and process the request, and we send a response. So here you can see that depending on different situations, we're sending different responses. So here we're returning an OK response, and here we're returning a bad request response, depending on the logic inside of the HTTP functions. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase all of this. And we're going to be building out our own HTTP function. So let's go back to the documentation. And we see here that the function is supposed to be built as export function prefix function name request. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this code and I'm going to put it in our site. And we're told that in the documentation that we have that the prefix is one of these methods over here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all these methods over. And I'm just going to be adding some comments up here so we can see. So these are the request methods. And that is, let me do it commenting out this way. So I'm going to comment out like this, request methods. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and paste them over here. So we have get, we have post, put, delete, options, and use. So today I'm not going to be talking about options because that's slightly more complicated and there are less use cases, but I'm going to be talking about the other 5. Okay, so get essentially means give me information. Post means add information. Put means update information. And delete means remove information. Okay, so for example, if I was to have a database and I wanted to get an item from the database, then I would use get. If I wanted to add information, then I would use post. If I wanted to make a change to a specific item, I would use put. And if I was going to use If I wanted to remove information, I would use delete. Use is essentially something that Wix gives us if we don't want to specify a specific method. So this could essentially be get, post, put, or delete, depending on what the request is. And it's important to clarify that the request is specified by the person making the request. So when they're making the request, they're going to say, this is a get request, this is a post request, this is a put request, or a delete request. Okay, they're going to specify. And based on the type of request, it'll run the appropriate function in our server. Okay, so essentially, this doesn't change the functionality of what happens in our server. It just changes what function is going to run or what information is going to be accessed or changed, but not how it's done. So for example, if I was to write here get as the prefix, and then I am going to write here example, and here we have the request. Okay, so here we could just say, let's say console.log request. And let's say I copy this function over and I have this as post. So that means that if somebody says, sends a request that is a get method, whatever is inside of this function will run. And if they send a post request, then whatever is inside of this function will run. And if I have another function that is a use function, then whatever they send in terms of get, post, put, or delete will run this use function. If we take a look at the documentation here at use, we can see that if the, I don't remember exactly where it says it here. One second. Okay, so if you create functions named get my function and use my function, get calls will be handled by the get my function, while the others will be used by post, put, delete. So for example, in this situation, since we've already specified get and post, then use will only be relevant for put and delete. Okay, so its use will only run for the functions that were not specified. But if we did specify a specific action for get or post, then it will run that function. Okay, so that's just an overview of the different request methods and how to build out the functions. So let's try and make an example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a backend file here. And this is going to be our test file. And we're actually going to use this file to make calls to our own HTTP functions. Okay, again, this doesn't have to be run from our website. This could be run from, any website. But since this is the simplest way to demonstrate this, I'm using our site. And I'm going to create a function. And I'm going to call this test HTTP. And I'm going to make an async function because we're going to be making a call to an API. And I'm going to import fetch from Wix fetch. So now in order to make a call to these HTTP functions that we just created, we need to know what the URL is for these functions. And that we can find in the documentation. So if you go here into introduction, then you can see here that they tell us how these URLs should be structured. And it's a little different if it's a premium site or if it's a free site, but you can use it on both. And I'm currently using a free site for the demo. So this is the structure of the URL. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that over and go back to test. And I'm going to say URL URL equals this URL. And here for username and site name, I'm just going to go to my live site, which is right over here. And I'm going to copy this URL and head back to the demo. I'm just going to replace everything here with the URL from my live site. Okay, and here you see that there's this underscore functions that should not be touched. And here we have the function name, which if you remember, we called it example. Okay, and here obviously I need to declare this as a constant. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to say const response equals to fetch, await fetch. And here we have our URL. And const data will be equal to response.json. And we're going to return the data. So before we actually start running this, we have to make a few changes to our HTTP functions. So I'm going to go ahead to our HTTP functions, and we have to deal with what our response is going to be. So we dealt with requests, but we didn't really deal with responses. So if you take a look at the documentation, we can see here, and unfortunately it's ordered by alphabetical order and not really by relevance or groups of what it is. So we have within this list, we have also the requests and also the responses. And I'm just going to be using this OK response. And basically what that will convey is that the request is OK. And we did whatever, the request came in correctly, and we're sending whatever information should be sent out. And we didn't encounter a situation where we were forbidden or it wasn't found or something along those lines, or a server error or something like that. And when we return OK, so automatically it'll create a response code of 200. And we can also return it with options. Okay, and these options would be whatever data we're sending back from our function. So for example, if I copy over these options and I go over here, and from our get example, I'm going to return OK with options. And I'm going to, so if you get these squiggly red lines, it's because we have to import OK. So I'm going to go ahead and import OK from, I have to remember what this is called, Wix HTTP Functions. Okay. And here we didn't declare options yet, so let's do that over here. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this, and you can see here that the options are built up of two things. So body, that's the actual information that we're sending back. And you can see here it's in JSON format. And headers are different metadata, different information about our response. And I'm just telling it that the content type is application /JSON. Okay, and that essentially says to the person receiving the data, okay, this is how you should interpret this data that you're receiving. And I'm going to change the body here to say message. And I'm going to say get request received. Okay. And I'm going to copy all this over, and I'm going to put it here in the post. And I'm going to say here instead post request received. Okay, just to mark which kind of request we got back and which response we're giving. So now I'm going to go ahead and publish our site. Okay, and go to our test file, and I'm going to run this function. So I'm going to go ahead and click run. And it was returned with message get request received. So now you might be asking yourself, okay, why is it get? but we didn't specify if we're doing get or post or... So the answer is that when you don't specify what kind of method you're using, it automatically uses a get method. But if we wanted to specify what kind of method we're using, then we can also declare options. So I can say const options, and I can say method, and here I'd write post, and I can pass these options along in with our URL, and this should make a post request to the server instead. So let's go ahead and test this one out. So I'm going to get rid of what we tested previously and run this, and post request received. Okay, so that is a simple demonstration of how HTTP functions work. Let me go one step further and show you how maybe different responses would be sent to different kinds of requests. So I'm going to go here to HTTP functions, and I'm going to say that I'm going to look for the request.body. So request.body would be whatever information is sent over, any parameters that were sent over as a body to our server. And in a post situation, it is very typical that we'll have a body because we're essentially creating new information. We're, let's say, adding an item to a database. And if we don't get the data for that item, then we have an issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if we have any data in the body. And if we don't have a body or we don't have the data, then we're going to have a problem. So let's go here to our documentation. And if we go here into HTTP function request, we could see we have here different elements of the request. And one of those is the body. And once we get the body, we can turn that into a certain format. So we can turn it into, if you take a look over here, we could essentially turn it into buffer, JSON, or text. I'm going to use JSON because that is the most common. So I'm going to say over here that once we get our request, I'm going to say const body equals request.body.json. And since this is asynchronous, I'm going to turn this into an async function and await this request.body.json. And this should give us the body now as an object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if no body. Okay, so if the body doesn't come back, then I'm going to return that there was missing information. So typically for each different issue, there's a very specific status code that you're supposed to send back. I'm trying to remember now what the specific status code would be for missing information. So I'm going to put here bad request. Okay, so typically you would use this bad request 400 when there is some kind of problem with the request, and not having a body would be a problem. So here you can see a typical example of this over here. So error, the request must contain X parameter. Okay, so basically if there's no body, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the options to be this error, and that's what we're going to send back with the bad request. So let me open up an if statement here. And I'm going to say, I'm going to move this options up over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the body part of the options. So I'm just going to save that the options is still this header. And I'm going to say here that options.body should be equal to error request must contain a body. And then we are going to return. We're going to need to import this up here first. Bad request. and I'm going to return bad request with the options. Okay, and let's see how this works out. Oh, here, before we return okay, let's just say options dot body equals message item added successfully. Okay, so we successfully submitted whatever item it was to the database. So now let's go to our, first I'm going to publish this. You have to publish these functions for them to work. And I'm going to go here to test, and we're still doing our post method, but now I need to, well, let's first test it out without a body. Okay, so now I'm sending a post, but I'm not sending a body. And I'm going to add another console here, console log, to get the full response. So you can see the status code and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and test that out. Okay, and here you can see that we couldn't get the response.json at the end. We had an error because our status came back as 400 bad request. Okay, and the body, let me see if I can get the body out of here. Okay, so after doing some debugging, I discovered that this issue is actually a Wix-specific issue. And if we take a look again at our HTTP function, so we can see here that we were trying to get the JSON for our body. And apparently what Wix does, if there is no JSON for the body, like if the body is empty, it'll automatically send out a bad request. So what's happening here is that as soon as we reach this line in the code, then Wix is just returning bad request. And we can prove that by adding a console here. I'm going to say we reached this line. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this. And this will also be a short lesson in debugging HTTP functions. So the way we're going to see this console log is actually here in our logs. And you can get to this from your dashboard, developer tools, logs. And here we're in site events. And here we're going to see all of the logs from our backend. So if you've been using backend files before, then you're familiar with this. So this is where we see all the logs from the HTTP functions as well. And if I go ahead and I make a call from our test function here, I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we got back our response. I'm going to check out the logs. So we see here that we have one error, that the body is in valid JSON format. So that's being thrown by that line that's trying to convert the body into JSON. But we can see here that we're not reaching the line where I put right after that code that says we've reached this line. So essentially Wix is kind of taking the lead here and automatically sending back a status 400. And the problem is that it's not sending back this status 400 with the body that we specified. And that's why we can't really get a body out of our test function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little more specific. So if we go back to our demo and we go to the HTTP function, so I'm not going to return this bad request options if there's no body at all, but I'm going to do it if the body.content is, let's say, dot length is smaller than 10. Okay, so, and we get rid of this over here. Excellent. And then I'm going to say error, and then I'm going to say content must be at least 10 characters. Okay, so this is a characters. Okay, and this is an example. This is actually a more realistic example of bad request. It basically double checks that everything in the body is as you expected it to be. And it's very common that, let's say, if a certain field that you're looking for is not in the right format or not containing, for example, the right amount of characters, then you would respond with a bad request. So this is actually quite a realistic situation. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish this. And this time from our test function, so we are going to send a body. So I'm going to say const body, and this will have content. And it's just going to say hello. Okay, so that's less than 10 characters. So what I'm expecting is to get back the bad request. And we're going to pass our body here, JSON.stringify body, because we're sending it in JSON format. And I'm going to also add this same header with content type, just because that's the content type that we're sending over. So I'm going to add this as well into our options. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Get rid of our previous attempts and click run. Excellent. And now we see that we got back error. Content must be at least 10 characters. Okay, and the response was bad request. Okay, so that's an example of how to use bad request. Just one small thing here is that this should actually have an await here. You always want to await response.json. I caught that out of the corner of my eye just now. And it worked, but this is because response.json is essentially a promise. So you always want to have the await keyword over here. And that is how to use different responses based on different logic and different situations within your HTTP functions. I'm going to wrap up with this today, just to recap what we did. So we briefly introduced HTTP functions and different request methods, as well as different responses. We talked about how to structure the HTTP functions in the HTTP functions file within your Wix backend. And we also talked about how the URLs are structured that make these calls to the HTTP functions. In the next few videos, I'm going to be talking about how to create a webhook that you can supply to another app or service that sends out events, and how to create your very own full REST API from your Wix website. So if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.